He was sent to judge a legend, and almost destroyed the woman who protected it. Ellie could tell what kind of day it would be by the way the morning air settled over the valley. That day it was heavy, still, the kind of silence that pressed against metal and skin alike. She stood inside classic and steel, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back without ceremony, a thin layer of grease already darkening her fingers. The Ferrari rested in the center bay like a restrained predator, low, elegant, and dangerous in its quiet confidence. Even stripped of noise and motion, it demanded attention. The 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO was not just rare, it was myth made of aluminum and fuel. Ellie had learned early that machines didn't care about reputation, only truth. She leaned into the engine bay, listening, not with her ears, but with experience. The metal spoke in tolerances, in resistance, in memory. Her father had taught her that. If you rush a machine, it punishes you. The crunch of tires on gravel broke the rhythm. Ellie straightened slowly. A black sedan rolled through the gate, out of place against the worn fencing and open fields. It stopped too carefully, like the driver was afraid of dust touching the paint. She didn't smile. City. The door opened, and a man stepped out who looked exactly like she expected, and still annoyed her. Julian adjusted his coat out of habit, even though no one was watching. He took in the workshop with a professional, dismissive scan. The weathered structure, the lack of polished branding, the smell of oil that no amount of ventilation could fully erase. He had seen this kind of place before, small, proud, convinced of its own authenticity. Usually, he proved them wrong. Montana had not been on his schedule. The inspection was supposed to be procedural, a checkbox before the Ferrari was shipped for auction. Instead, he was here, standing on gravel, questioning how a car of this magnitude had ended up in a shop that looked like it belonged to another decade. Ellie watched him approach. "You're Julian," she said flatly. He paused, surprised she hadn't waited for an introduction. "Yes, and you're Ellie." "That's right." He glanced behind her, then back at the workshop. "I assumed there would be more people," she cut in. "No, there's just me." Something in her tone shut down the rest of the sentence. Julian recalibrated. He stepped closer to the Ferrari despite himself, drawn by instinct rather than intention. Up close, the details started to bother him, in the wrong way. The work was careful, too careful for a fake. The body panels were aligned with restraint, not perfection. The wear was preserved where it mattered. The engine bay wasn't staged for photographs. It was honest. Julian crouched, scanning serial placements, rivet patterns, weld scars only people like him memorized. "You know why I'm here," he said finally. Ellie nodded. "To make sure this car is real, and that you didn't build a story around it." She met his gaze, unflinching. "I don't build stories. I restore machines." There was no defensiveness in her voice, no eagerness to impress. That unsettled him more than arrogance would have. They began the inspection properly then. Julian documented everything: photographs, notes, quiet voice memos. Ellie answered when asked, nothing more. She didn't hover. She didn't perform. When he questioned a component, she didn't argue. She showed him. Hours passed. The daylight shifted from sharp to soft, sliding through the workshop windows and stretching shadows across the concrete floor. Julian realized he had stopped looking for mistakes and started looking for logic. Ellie's work had a philosophy behind it. Not restoration as spectacle, but restoration as restraint. "You've done competition-level work," he said at one point. "Yes." "Where?" "Here," she replied. "And wherever people couldn't afford to lose what they loved." That answer stayed with him longer than it should have. As evening approached, the inspection deepened. Panels came off. Old documentation emerged from folders worn at the edges. Ellie brought out notebooks, handwritten, meticulous, spanning years. Julian felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Respect. At some point, coffee appeared on the workbench. Later, beer. No invitation. Just presence. They worked closer now. Sometimes their shoulders brushed. Sometimes their hands reached for the same tool and paused, hovering in the shared space between them. Neither commented. Neither retreated. Julian noticed the way Ellie listened to the engine with her entire body, like it was a living thing. Ellie noticed the way Julian checked facts, not to dominate, but to understand. This wasn't supposed to happen. When night finally settled outside, Montana revealed itself in full, vast, indifferent, endless. Inside the workshop, under industrial lights and surrounded by steel and memory, two people who trusted nothing but competence found themselves drawn into a quiet, dangerous alignment. Julian straightened, rolling his shoulders. "We'll need to continue tomorrow." Ellie nodded. "I figured." Their eyes met again, longer this time. Professional boundaries still held. Barely. Neither of them said what they were thinking. Neither of them yet understood that this inspection was no longer about a car. And that was exactly how everything would begin to unravel. The next morning arrived cold, sharp, and bright. Montana's thin sun cut through the frost along the valley floor, painting the workshop roof in streaks of gold. Ellie arrived early, boots crunching over the gravel, coffee steaming in hand. Julian was already there, leaning against the hood of a truck he had borrowed from a local friend of the auction house. Phone in one hand, notebook in the other, eyes scanning the interior of the workshop with habitual precision. "You made coffee," he said without looking up. "Always," Ellie replied, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "You might survive today if you keep up." Julian allowed a small smirk. She didn't know him yet. She had no idea how little he needed survival in that room. He needed truth. And truth, in his world, came at a price. They returned to the Ferrari, opening panels, inspecting engine parts, and noting the minutiae most would overlook: rivets, heat markings, original welds, subtle differences in metal grain. Ellie worked with quiet confidence, her hands precise, almost reverent. Julian observed, occasionally asking pointed questions that were as much about her process as about the car itself. "This alignment here," he said, pointing to the rear suspension mounts. "It's different than factory spec, but not wrong." Ellie glanced at him, eyebrow raised. "Different, yes. Wrong, no. Original chassis tolerances were inconsistent. I preserved the variance." Julian paused, impressed despite himself. "You didn't just restore it. You researched it. Understood it." "I restore what it is, not what people say it should be," she replied. There was a pause, not uncomfortable, but full of weight. In the silence, Julian realized he was no longer looking at a provincial mechanic. He was looking at someone who shared his obsession for detail, someone who could feel the heartbeat of the machine. "You're good," he admitted quietly. Ellie tilted her head, still working. "You're not easy to impress." "Not easily impressed," he said, letting the words linger between them. "But when it happens, it counts." The professional tension began to blend subtly with something else. Every gesture, every glance became charged. Not romantic, not yet, but undeniably magnetic. Their collaboration, originally driven by audit and duty, started to feel like a conversation conducted in metal, gears, and unspoken trust. Hours passed. The sun climbed, shadows shifting across the workshop, coating the floor in golden light. Julian found himself learning not only the car's story but Ellie's, her devotion to the legacy of her family's work, her late nights alone in the shop, the meticulous journals she kept tracking the provenance of every piece she touched. He listened, occasionally asking questions, but mostly watching her operate like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of iron and oil. By midday, a rhythm had settled between them. Julian documented, Ellie explained, and the Ferrari seemed to respond to their joint focus, as though recognizing the reverence in their hands. Even the air felt different, thick with concentration, subtle tension, and something neither dared name yet. Then, unexpectedly, the topic shifted. Julian reached into his folder and extracted old auction catalogs, scanned documents, and receipts. "Why keep all this?" he asked, nodding toward her meticulous notes. "Do you plan to sell it someday?" Ellie paused, wiping grease from her palms. "Not everything is about profit. Some of it is about truth, about knowing what belonged to whom, and preserving it correctly." "And if someone tried to challenge it," he asked, eyes narrowing slightly, "could anyone fake this level of documentation?" She shrugged, setting a wrench aside. "They could try, but it wouldn't hold up under someone who actually knows what to look for." Julian's pulse quickened, not in alarm, but in admiration. This woman wasn't just skilled. She was unshakable, principled, and uncompromising. Traits rare in his world of auctions, sales, and corporate games. Traits he wasn't used to respecting, let alone wanting to understand so fully. A subtle change occurred as they worked. Hands brushed over tools, shoulders collided near the engine bay. Neither flinched, neither apologized. Their energy became a quiet dialogue. Challenge, acknowledgement, respect. Julian noted the precision of her movements, the quiet authority she exercised over her space, the way she spoke with confidence but never condescension. Every observation deepened his sense that he was learning not just about the car, but about the woman who had devoted herself to it. By evening, they had traced the engine's serial numbers, checked chassis markings against archives, and verified original parts with forensic patience. Julian paused, looking at the notes, then at Ellie. You didn't just restore this car. You brought it back to life. You honored it. Ellie looked up, eyes catching the last streaks of sunlight spilling into the workshop. That's all any of us can do, she said simply. But Julian saw the quiet pride that ran under her words, a stubborn, fierce pride in a world that rarely rewarded the small victories of honesty and skill. As night fell, Montana's mountains silhouetted against the deep blue sky. The workshop settled into a silence interrupted only by the ticking of a wall clock and the occasional clank of tools being put away. Julian stood, stretching, feeling the unfamiliar exhaustion of a day spent in focus, collaboration, and subtle tension. Ellie leaned against the car, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Tomorrow, she said. We finish the interior and check the documentation against the auction records. That's the final step. Julian nodded, but he didn't move toward the door. Instead, he studied her, seeing not the provincial mechanic he had dismissed at first glance, but someone whose skill, dedication, and intellect demanded respect. And perhaps, he admitted quietly, someone whose presence he wouldn't mind prolonging beyond the workshop walls. Tomorrow, he agreed, but the word carried weight, both professional and unspoken. Something had shifted, subtly, irrevocably, in the space between tools, oil, and the hum of a Ferrari that had survived decades. The first day of inspection ended, and though the Ferrari slept under blankets and care, the workshop itself had become the quiet arena of a more complex, unspoken duel of minds, respect, and unacknowledged attraction that neither of them could yet name. Before Julian could even greet her, the garage door rattled open. In stepped a tall man, sharply dressed, with a calculated smile that didn't reach his eyes. His presence immediately altered the air in the room. Simon, Julian said, his voice clipped. Recognition, and a twinge of unease, colored his words. Simon's gaze flicked over Ellie briefly, assessing, measuring. Then he turned his attention back to Julian. Julian, always a pleasure, he said smoothly. I hear you've been inspecting a particularly unique Ferrari. Ellie straightened instinctively, hands gripping the edge of the workbench. She had heard rumors of Simon from Julian's occasional mentions, a mentor-turned-competitor, a man with influence that stretched from Manhattan to Geneva, whose moral compass had long since been overshadowed by ambition. I'm here to ensure that the Ferrari 250 GTO in question is authentic, Simon continued, addressing Julian but casting a sidelong glance at Ellie. It's a rare car, worth more than most people make in a lifetime. It would be unfortunate if it were misrepresented. Julian's jaw tightened. We're conducting a thorough inspection. I trust that the records and evidence will speak for themselves. Simon's smile widened, but there was an edge to it, a knife disguised as politeness. Oh, I'm sure they will. But I'd hate for anyone to be misled, especially when reputations are at stake. Ellie felt a ripple of unease. There was something in Simon's tone, an insinuation that was both subtle and poisonous. She met Julian's eyes, searching for reassurance. He gave her a barely perceptible nod, but she could sense his own tension. Simon had a reputation for planting doubt, and Julian knew it better than anyone. As Simon began to circle the car, inspecting panels and tracing chassis numbers with practiced detachment, Julian followed closely, countering each observation with his own notes and explanations. Ellie interjected when necessary, defending her restoration choices, her voice steady but firm. This piece here, Simon said, tapping lightly on the rear quarter panel, doesn't match the original factory specs. Are you certain it hasn't been replaced? Ellie's response was calm, unwavering. It has been restored using verified period parts. I've documented every piece, every weld. Nothing has been replaced with modern components. Simon's eyes narrowed, calculating. Interesting. And these documents? He held up a folder, the edges crisp and slightly yellowed. Were they created contemporaneously with the restoration, or after the fact? Julian intervened, a quiet authority in his voice. They were created during the restoration process, verified by independent appraisers at every stage. Your insinuation doesn't hold. Simon's smile tightened, and for a brief moment, the air between the three of them became taut, like a wire pulled to its limit. He stepped closer to Ellie, lowering his voice slightly. Of course, mistakes happen, especially when one is passionate. But mistakes can be costly. Ellie's hands clenched at her sides. She had faced criticism before, but there was a venom in Simon's demeanor that went beyond professional scrutiny. Julian placed a hand lightly on the folder she had been referencing, a silent shield. You won't find any mistakes, Julian said evenly. And if you continue with insinuations, I will ensure that your reputation as a mentor-turned-competitor precedes you in any professional circle that matters. Simon laughed lightly, the sound hollow. Confidence is charming, Julian. But confidence won't protect you if someone decides to question the authenticity of this car publicly. The words hung in the air. Ellie felt a chill that had nothing to do with Montana's winter. Simon's intentions were clear. He wanted her to doubt herself, to undermine the legitimacy of her work, and to sow discord between her and Julian. Julian's gaze sharpened. I will not allow that, he said, voice low but resolute. And neither will she. Simon's expression flickered, just briefly, but it was enough for Julian to see the cracks in the facade. Very well, he said finally, with a deliberate calm that belied the tension. I will observe. But know this, the smallest irregularity can be devastating in our world. And you, Ms. Ellie, should be aware that your reputation, and that of your workshop, depends entirely on scrutiny like this. Without another word, Simon turned and exited the workshop, his presence leaving behind a lingering unease, like smoke that had not yet dissipated. Ellie exhaled slowly, feeling the adrenaline drain from her body. Julian watched her closely, reading the subtle signals of stress and resolve. You okay? He asked gently, stepping closer. She met his gaze, the flicker of fear in her eyes tempered by determination. I've faced skeptics before, she said, brushing a hand over her apron. But that felt different. Julian nodded, understanding. Simon's interference wasn't just professional, it was personal. He was testing boundaries, planting seeds of doubt, and attempting to manipulate the situation for his own gain. Ellie returned to the Ferrari, her hands moving over the engine as if to draw strength from familiarity. Julian remained beside her, silent for a moment, then spoke. We'll handle this. Together. We have the documentation, the parts verification, and the records. He has nothing concrete, just threats and insinuations. For the first time, the tension between them shifted from mutual admiration and subtle attraction to a shared mission. The workshop, once a place of quiet labor and meticulous restoration, became a battlefield of wits, trust, and endurance. Hours passed as they worked late into the evening, verifying parts, cross-referencing records, and ensuring that every detail was bulletproof. The conversation drifted from technicalities to personal stories. Ellie's struggles with preserving her father's legacy, Julian's exhaustion from the morally gray world of auctions, and their shared understanding of pressure, expectation, and the weight of perfection. By nightfall, the workshop was bathed in the soft glow of hanging lamps. The Ferrari rested under blankets, safe, pristine, and verified. Julian and Ellie stood across from each other, exhaustion in their limbs, but clarity in their minds. This isn't just about the car anymore, Ellie said quietly. It's about proving ourselves and protecting what matters. Julian's gaze softened, the sharp edges of the day melting into something warmer. Yes, and we won't let Simon, or anyone else, undermine that. Not you, not this car, not the work we've done. There was a pause, a subtle charge in the air, a recognition of trust and growing connection. Their hands hovered near each other as they gathered tools, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that this partnership, born of respect and shared purpose, was becoming something more. As Julian turned off the lights and locked the workshop doors, the night outside Montana was deep and silent. Stars shimmered faintly above, indifferent observers to the human drama unfolding below. Inside, however, a quiet alliance had been forged, resilient, determined, and poised to confront the challenges yet to come. Ellie glanced at Julian one last time before leaving, the weight of the day's revelations and the subtle tension between them lingering in her chest. Julian felt it too, a mixture of admiration, professional respect, and the undeniable spark that had ignited between them since the first inspection. The shadow of Simon had entered their world, but it had also clarified something crucial. Together, they were stronger than any doubt, any insinuation, any threat. And the real battle, for truth, reputation, and perhaps even trust, was only beginning. The following day dawned gray and heavy over Montana, the sky a low, pressurized blanket pressing against the mountains. Ellie arrived at Classic and Steel early, already anticipating the intensity of the day. Julian had insisted on meeting her before the insurance representatives arrived, and the tension in the air was palpable. Julian was already there, standing near the bench where Ellie kept the meticulously labeled engine parts of the Ferrari. His expression was a mixture of resolve and apprehension, fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the workbench. "Ellie," he began, voice low, almost conspiratorial, "I received word from the insurance company last night. They're freezing all activity tied to this Ferrari until the audit is complete. And their instructions? Well, let's just say they expect me to dig deep into your workshop, to verify every claim, every restoration detail, and even to examine the provenance of every part you've touched." Ellie felt a tight knot form in her stomach. "They want you to spy on me." Julian's jaw tightened. "In essence, yes. And if any irregularities are found, the insurance could refuse coverage, the auction could collapse, and your reputation could take a hit that would make this Ferrari impossible to sell. Essentially, they've handed me the impossible choice, duty versus trust." Ellie's hands clenched around a wrench. "And where do I fit into this? Am I just the obstacle in their corporate game?" Julian took a deep breath, running a hand through his hair. "No, Ellie, you're not an obstacle. You're the reason I can't walk away from this job. But I need you to understand the stakes. Every detail, every document you've provided, will be scrutinized. I can't protect you if I don't do it properly." The workshop door creaked open and two representatives from Julian's insurance company stepped inside, clipboard and tablet in hand, faces neutral but eyes sharp and calculating. "Mr. Julian," one began smoothly, "thank you for accommodating us. We're here to ensure that all assets involved meet our standards. The Ferrari 250 GTO is considered a high-risk item, given its rarity and value." Ellie's fingers twitched on the edge of the workbench. "High risk, or high-maintenance ego of some corporate executive?" she muttered under her breath. Julian caught it, his lips pressing into a thin line. Knowing the words were more than humor, they were defiance. The representatives began their inspection, asking pointed questions, cross-referencing serial numbers, inspecting engine welds, and reviewing every restoration receipt Ellie had ever documented. Julian hovered, interjecting when necessary, defending her expertise, explaining nuances that only someone intimately familiar with both the car and its history could articulate. Hours passed. The initial tension grew into a psychological dance. Ellie felt the pressure of the scrutiny not as a critique of her skill, but as a probe into her life, her choices, her integrity. Julian, meanwhile, felt the weight of dual responsibility. He had to comply with corporate orders, yet maintain trust with Ellie. At one point, Simon's name surfaced. The auditors asked Julian if he had considered potential conflicts of interest regarding prior mentorships or rivalries. Julian's chest tightened. He knew exactly what they were implying, that the Ferrari could be a pawn in Simon's scheme, and that any association, however distant, might undermine the audit. Ellie noticed the flicker of doubt in Julian's eyes, subtle but present. Her throat tightened. She wanted to scream that she had done nothing wrong, that she had built every restoration with integrity. Instead, she let her hands move over the engine, steadying herself with each turn of a bolt, each adjustment of a carburetor. Julian finally stepped closer to her, lowering his voice. "Ellie, you need to hear this. If the insurance finds anything, any discrepancy, even minor, they could refuse coverage, cancel the auction, and potentially flag the Ferrari as inauthentic. You could be blacklisted." Ellie's hands froze mid-motion. "And you?" she asked softly, hurt lacing the words. "Where do you stand? Are you just doing their bidding?" Julian's gaze was unwavering. "No, I'm here because I trust you. But I also have obligations. I can't lie to my company. I can't risk their wrath. This is my test as much as it is yours." Her chest tightened. "So, I'm supposed to sit quietly while you sift through my life, my work, like it's all a fraud?" "Not quietly," Julian said, firm but gentle. "Actively. We're doing this together. We show them your work, your records, your integrity. That's the only way to survive this scrutiny. And I promise, every word I speak, every document I present, will support you, not condemn you." Ellie exhaled slowly, the tension easing slightly, but never fully leaving. The rest of the day became a meticulous balancing act. Julian led the auditors through the workshop, explaining each step of the restoration process in painstaking detail. Ellie demonstrated techniques, showed archived photographs, and traced the origin of every vintage part. By late afternoon, the auditors had reviewed nearly every aspect of the Ferrari and the workshop's records. They exchanged quiet words, nodding occasionally, jotting notes. Julian and Ellie shared a private glance, silent acknowledgement of the endurance required, the trust tested, and the fragility of the situation. As the representatives finally packed up to leave, the tension in the workshop remained, thick but transformed. It was no longer just a corporate examination. It was a crucible that had tested boundaries, revealed vulnerabilities, and forced honesty between two people who were slowly realizing that the stakes of trust were higher than any auction. Julian exhaled, leaning against the workbench. "We survived the first wave," he said, eyes softening. "But Simon, he's not done. He's going to try to manipulate this from behind the scenes. We need to be ready." Ellie nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I know, but at least now, I know where we stand. Together. If we hold our ground, no one can touch this car. Or us." For a brief moment, the workshop was quiet, the soft clinking of tools and the hum of the heater the only sounds. In that stillness, both Julian and Ellie understood that the coming days would demand more than technical skill. They would demand loyalty, courage, and a willingness to face deception head-on. And as the Montana sky darkened outside, streaked with clouds heavy with impending snow, the Ferrari gleamed under the workshop lights, a symbol of endurance, authenticity, and the fragile but growing bond between two people who had, for the first time, been forced to trust completely in one another. The evening had fallen over Montana like a slow, settling weight, the mountains silhouetted against a pale orange sky. Inside classic and steel, the Ferrari 250 GTO gleamed under the workshop lights, its curves catching every reflection, every shadow. Julian leaned against the workbench, a folder of documents in his hands, eyes scanning each line with meticulous precision, yet his mind was not entirely on the paperwork. Ellie worked nearby, carefully polishing a vintage carburetor, the rhythmic motion of her hands betraying both skill and calm determination. But Julian's gaze kept drifting back to her, watching the subtle way her brow furrowed when concentrating, the way her fingers moved with both strength and grace. Something in him, a mix of admiration, desire, and fear, kept pulling him off track. Then came Simon. Julian had received a brief, cryptic message earlier that day. "Check your bank transfers. There's more beneath the surface than you think. Trust me." Julian's stomach churned. He knew Simon's reputation, calculating, persuasive, and often dangerously manipulative, but part of him wanted to believe, to rationalize that perhaps Simon was warning him in good faith. Julian opened the folder again, revealing a document that looked terrifyingly official, a bank transfer with a verified digital clearance stamp, showing a significant sum from a black market supplier to Ellie's account. It wasn't just a claim from Simon. It was a forged bank record that looked indistinguishable from the truth. The line of numbers glowed on the page, and Julian's breath caught. Ellie noticed the change in his demeanor immediately. "Julian," she asked, tilting her head, concern creeping into her voice. "What is it?" He swallowed hard, trying to maintain composure. "It's a transfer, Ellie, and it's not just a rumor. This document has a bank authentication code," he said, his voice cracking. "It's a direct link to a black market supplier. If the auditors see this verified stamp, they won't even ask for your side of the story. They'll just destroy you." Ellie froze, her hands halting mid-motion. A sharp spike of anger and hurt flared in her chest. "You don't trust me?" she whispered, barely audible, yet the words cut deeper than any tool could. Julian shook his head quickly, trying to explain. It's not that I don't trust you. I've been by your side, defending your work, showing the auditors every piece, explaining everything. But you're believing a document from Simon without asking me. Ellie interrupted, voice rising. Do you know what this feels like? That all the time, all the trust, all the effort. It's meaningless if you think I'm manipulating you. Julian looked at her, guilt and confusion warring in his expression. I just need to be sure. You understand the stakes here. If there's even a shadow of fraud, the Ferrari, the auction, everything we've worked for could collapse. I have responsibilities. Ellie's eyes flashed, a mixture of pain and fury. Responsibilities? To Simon? To your company? What about me? Or is that just a footnote in your ledger? Julian flinched at her words, but she didn't let up. I invited you into my world. I let you see the heart of this workshop, the truth of my work. And now, because of a single line in a bank document, you're doubting me? You're doubting us. The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Julian looked away, guilt cutting deeper than any accusation. He wanted to explain, to reach across the workbench and reassure her, but the document burned in his hands like a live wire. Finally, Ellie set down the carburetor with deliberate care, crossing her arms. Julian, maybe you should go. Take the time to figure out what you really believe. Because right now, I don't think you're here for me. I think you're here for what's easy for you. Your duty, your reputation, your rules. And that isn't enough. Julian's heart pounded, each beat a drum of regret. Ellie, go, she said, voice firm, eyes glistening. I can't have someone questioning my integrity while standing in my own workshop. Leave. He wanted to argue, to fight for her trust, but words faltered, caught in the tight knot of uncertainty. With a heavy exhale, Julian gathered his coat and the folder, avoiding her eyes as he stepped toward the door. Each step felt like a betrayal, each motion weighted by the unspoken tension between duty and desire. As he reached the threshold, he paused, hand on the handle, looking back one last time. Ellie's posture was rigid, the fire in her eyes a mixture of anger and heartbreak. I'm sorry, he whispered, barely audible, though it carried the weight of truth he couldn't fully express. And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a hollow finality. Alone in the workshop, Ellie sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. The Ferrari sat in the center of the room, a gleaming monument to her passion and skill, yet suddenly it felt like a mirror reflecting the fracture that had just formed between them. Betrayal, doubt, and fear mingled in the air, thicker than the scent of oil and polished metal. Outside, Julian walked toward his car, the Montana wind cutting through his coat. Every step was heavy, burdened with the weight of suspicion, guilt, and a gnawing question. Had he allowed Simon's manipulations to poison the only bond that had mattered in weeks? The bank document was damning, yet something inside him refused to believe Ellie capable of deceit. He stopped at the edge of the road, staring at the workshop lit softly in the night. He realized that this fracture, this doubt, was only temporary. If he could uncover the truth, if he could see past Simon's schemes, he could repair what had just been broken. But the path ahead was uncertain, lined with risk, confrontation, and the fragile rebuilding of trust. For Ellie, the night stretched long and quiet. She didn't sleep, instead circling the workshop, inspecting tools, touching the Ferrari, and reminding herself that she had built her life with integrity. And yet, a hollow ache lingered where Julian's trust had once been, a reminder that even the strongest bonds could be shaken by shadows and lies. The first real storm had hit, not from the mountains or the weather, but from doubt, suspicion, and manipulation. And both Julian and Ellie would need to navigate it carefully, balancing suspicion with faith, action with patience, if they were to survive Simon's interference and reclaim the trust that had just fractured between them. The Montana morning was crisp, the air filled with the scent of pine and freshly turned soil. Julian's car rolled slowly along the winding road, but he barely noticed the scenery. His mind was occupied entirely with the puzzle that had shattered his trust last night. Every number in that bank document, every shadow cast by Simon's reputation, it all demanded scrutiny. He needed the truth, no matter how painful. Returning to his temporary lodgings, Julian spread the files out on the small wooden table, stacks of invoices, bank statements, and shipping logs forming a labyrinth of numbers and dates. Each line was a potential clue, each signature a possible key to unraveling the web Simon had spun. He took a deep breath, remembering Ellie's piercing gaze, the hurt and anger in her eyes. He couldn't lose her, not to doubt, not to manipulation. He didn't sleep. Instead, he spent the entire night on the phone, leveraging every contact he had in New York and Geneva to bypass the layers of secrecy Simon had built. By the time the first gray light of dawn hit the Montana horizon, he had finally cracked the digital trail of the Swiss accounts. The bank transfer that had sparked his suspicion became the centerpiece of his investigation. Julian traced the funds, following their convoluted path through multiple shell accounts, offshore banks, and intermediary companies. Slowly, the pattern emerged. The payment had never reached Ellie. It had been rerouted, cleverly masked, and ultimately returned to a Swiss account under Simon's name. His heart raced. This was the proof he needed, not just for Ellie, but for himself. Simon had orchestrated everything to cast doubt on her integrity, to manipulate Julian into questioning the one person who had shown him honesty and passion amidst a world of deceit. But uncovering the truth was only part of the challenge. Julian needed a plan. If Simon suspected he was investigating, any misstep could trigger retaliation, endangering not just Ellie's reputation, but the Ferrari itself. He carefully documented every finding, creating a timeline of Simon's actions, cross-referencing invoices, delivery records, and eyewitness accounts. Every small discrepancy, every delayed shipment, every forged signature became another thread in the tapestry of proof that would ultimately expose Simon's scheme. Meanwhile, Ellie's absence in the workshop weighed heavily on Julian. He remembered the way she had slammed the door last night, her words echoing, "I can't have someone questioning my integrity while standing in my own workshop." He winced at the memory, guilt gnawing at him. He had almost let a single document blind him to everything he knew of her character, her skill, and her honesty. By mid-afternoon, Julian decided he needed direct confirmation. He reached out to contacts in the industry, discreetly calling suppliers and mechanics who had interacted with Ellie over the years. Each call confirmed her professionalism, her meticulous attention to detail, and her absolute dedication to the cars she restored. No one had ever witnessed her accepting illicit payments or engaging in fraudulent activity. As the day stretched into evening, Julian felt a renewed determination. He had the evidence, he had the witnesses, and he had a strategy to confront Simon before the auction. But he also knew he had to regain Ellie's trust. She deserved more than explanations and proof. She deserved his acknowledgement of the pain his doubt had caused. Driving back to Classic and Steel, Julian rehearsed what he would say. He would begin with the facts, then move to the confession that he had allowed a shadow of suspicion to cloud his judgment, almost losing the one person whose integrity had never wavered. He would apologize, but more importantly, he would demonstrate through action that he believed in her completely. The workshop was quiet as Julian arrived, the fading sunlight streaming through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing lazily in the air. Ellie was at the center, working on the Ferrari's engine, completely absorbed in her craft. Julian took a careful step forward. "Ellie," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She looked up, eyes wary, guarded. Julian placed the documents on the bench between them, each file a testament to hours of painstaking investigation. "Everything," he began, his voice steady but laden with sincerity. "Everything Simon showed me, every suspicion I had, it was false. He's been manipulating the records, trying to make me doubt you, to discredit you, and ultimately to control the Ferrari for his own gain. None of it is true." Ellie's expression softened, but caution lingered. "And you believe me now?" she asked, her tone more measured than accusatory, though her eyes searched his for the truth. "I do," Julian said firmly, meeting her gaze. "I've traced every transaction, verified every supplier, and spoken to everyone who knows your work. You've done nothing wrong. It was never you. It was him, and I let it cloud my judgment. I let him manipulate me, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Ellie studied him, the anger in her eyes slowly giving way to relief and the faintest trace of a smile. She returned to the engine, but her hands worked with a lighter touch now, no longer weighed down by suspicion. Julian knelt beside her, assisting with a tricky alignment, their movements synchronized after years of shared passion for machinery, trust slowly rebuilding in every glance and gesture. "We have a problem to solve," Julian said, his tone shifting from apology to strategy. "Simon isn't going to stop. The auction is tomorrow, and if he tries to manipulate the public, we need evidence and witnesses ready. We need to anticipate his moves and counter them before he can act." Ellie nodded, wiping her hands on a rag. The determination in her eyes rekindled. "Then we do it right. No panic, no shortcuts. We'll expose him before he has a chance to strike." The two of them spent the night compiling evidence, organizing the workshop, and preparing for the confrontation that would define not only the Ferrari's fate, but their trust and partnership. Julian's meticulous attention to detail complemented Ellie's hands-on expertise. Each document, each observation, each mechanical adjustment was a step toward vindication. By the time the moon rose high above the Montana mountains, Classic and Steel had become both a fortress and a command center. The Ferrari gleamed under the work lights, a symbol of skill, integrity, and now, strategy. Julian and Ellie exchanged a look, a mixture of resolve, relief, and the rekindled bond that had almost been shattered by doubt. Tomorrow, Simon would discover that he had underestimated not just Ellie's talent, but their combined determination. The game was far from over, but the tide was shifting. And Julian knew, with certainty, that no fabricated document, no shadowy transfer, could sever the partnership and the unspoken trust that had been tested and strengthened in the quiet, electric hours of investigation. The next morning, the workshop was unusually quiet. Ellie moved through her tools with precision, but Julian sensed the tension thickening in the air, a weight that words alone could not dispel. Despite the long hours of investigation, proof in hand, and strategy carefully planned, there remained an invisible divide between them, fragile trust strained by past doubt. Julian approached cautiously, his voice low but determined. "Ellie, we have the evidence. Simon's scheme is exposed. Everything you feared about your reputation, it's cleared." Ellie paused, wiping her hands on a rag, eyes fixed on the Ferrari's polished body. There was a flicker of warmth, but it was tempered by lingering hurt. "I know what you found, Julian, and I appreciate it," she said, her voice measured. "But do you understand what your doubt did? How it felt to have someone question your integrity when you've spent years building everything from nothing?" Julian winced, guilt tightening his chest. I let Simon manipulate me. I should have trusted you from the start." "You should have," Ellie interrupted sharply, her tone edged with pain. "But you didn't. And now, after all of this, I'm left wondering, did any of this, any of us, ever mean anything to you beyond a convenient investigation?" Julian opened his mouth to speak, but words faltered. Every carefully reasoned explanation, every proof of loyalty, seemed fragile in the face of her raw, unfiltered emotion. He realized, in that moment, that truth alone could not repair the fracture. Ellie needed acknowledgement, not justification. She stepped back, creating physical space that mirrored the emotional distance. "I can't let this go," she continued, voice trembling slightly. "Not yet. You doubted me, Julian. You doubted me, and that's something I can't ignore." Julian swallowed hard, the weight of his own misjudgment pressing down. He had always relied on logic, evidence, and strategy, but relationships required a different kind of clarity, one that could not be measured in spreadsheets or timelines. "I understand," he said finally, voice quiet, almost a whisper. "I understand why you're hurt. I don't want to lose you, Ellie. Not now, not ever. But I can't undo what happened. I can only show you that I've changed, that I believe in you." Ellie's gaze softened for the briefest instant, then hardened again. Belief isn't enough this time. Trust isn't given back just because evidence clears your mind. I need more than words. I need proof in action. She walked toward the door, grabbing her jacket. "I need to step away. I need to see if this is just a temporary fix, or if what we have is real." Julian felt a hollow ache as the door swung closed. His stomach twisted, a mix of fear, regret, and a growing realization that he had pushed the one person who mattered most to the edge. He could have let the investigation alone, confronted Simon directly, but his hesitation, his momentary doubt, had allowed the fracture to deepen. He stood in the workshop, the tools, engines, and the Ferrari around him now seeming smaller, almost indifferent witnesses to the human conflict playing out. The silence was deafening, each tick of the clock echoing like a reminder of what he had almost lost. Determined not to fail again, Julian began mapping out his next steps. He reviewed the evidence again, organized witness statements, and outlined a precise plan to confront Simon at the auction. But this time, there was a personal urgency, more than professional obligation. He needed to protect Ellie's reputation and, if possible, restore the bond that his doubt had shattered. Meanwhile, Ellie stood outside the workshop, her hands resting on the cool metal of the doorframe. She inhaled the Montana air deeply, forcing herself to separate emotion from logic, desire from pride. The hurt was real, the anger justified, but so was the undeniable connection she felt with Julian. Their time together, the long nights spent uncovering the truth, the shared moments of laughter and focus, all of it had mattered. And yet, trust, once broken, demanded space to heal. For both of them, the day became a silent battlefield of thought and emotion. Julian moved meticulously through his plans, while Ellie wrestled with her own conflicted feelings, resentment battling attraction, pride resisting vulnerability. As evening approached, the workshop's shadows lengthened, mirroring the emotional chasm that had opened between them. Julian stood by the Ferrari, staring at the gleaming metal as if it held answers. He realized that the upcoming auction was more than a legal or professional confrontation. It was the opportunity to prove to Ellie, to the town, and to himself that integrity, courage, and dedication could triumph over deception, doubt, and betrayal. He spoke aloud to the empty room, voice firm despite the tension in his chest. Tomorrow, everything changes. Not just the car, not just Simon, but us. I'll make this right. One way or another, I'll make it right. Across town, Ellie made her own vow. I won't let him control me, my reputation, or my work. But trust, that has to be earned back. And I'm watching, Julian Harrington. The night settled over Montana, quiet and tense, as two determined hearts prepared for the final confrontation. Tomorrow would not be easy. Lies would be exposed, reputations tested, and perhaps, in the crucible of truth, trust, and love, could be reborn. The auction hall was packed, the air electric with anticipation and the faint scent of polished wood and leather. Collectors, dealers, and journalists all turned their attention to the gleaming Ferrari 250 GTO, now the center of a storm that had been building for days. Simon stood confidently by the car, exuding the calm of a man who believed he still controlled the game. But the cracks were beginning to show. Julian stepped forward, folders in hand, each document a carefully curated piece of the puzzle. His gaze met Simon's, cold and unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice resonating across the room. "What you're about to hear is the truth, not a story crafted for profit." Simon opened his mouth to interject, but Julian held up a hand. "Please, listen first." He gestured to Ellie, who stepped beside him, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. She opened a binder of letters, purchase records, and historical photographs, each annotated with meticulous notes and verified provenance. "This Ferrari is not a replica," Ellie declared, her voice ringing with conviction. "Every component, every serial number, every restoration detail aligns with original records. Simon's claim that it is a reproduction is false. He has manipulated facts to acquire the car for a fraction of its true value." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, shifting from curiosity to disbelief as Julian laid out the additional evidence. Falsified emails, bank transfers showing Simon's collusion with a shadowy third party, and witness statements from restorers and collectors confirming the car's authenticity. Simon's face tightened. He tried to regain composure, offering a rehearsed rebuttal about minor inconsistencies in the car's documentation. But Julian anticipated every objection. With a calm, measured tone, he presented the original manufacturer's certificates and shipping records, showing beyond doubt that the Ferrari was genuine and that any claims of forgery were orchestrated by Simon himself. A ripple of astonishment moved through the audience. Collectors whispered among themselves, journalists scribbled notes furiously, and Simon's confident mask began to crumble. He gestured sharply at Julian, trying to seize the narrative. "This isn't over," he hissed, but the weight of evidence pressed down, silencing him. Julian leaned slightly toward the audience, his voice firm. "Simon attempted to deceive this room, to profit from lies, and to discredit someone who has dedicated their life to preserving history. The truth is here. Not only is the Ferrari authentic, but Simon's manipulation has been exposed in full." The crowd erupted in a mixture of applause and murmured agreement. Some collectors approached Ellie, asking detailed questions about the restoration and provenance. The journalists began recording, capturing her every word. Simon's panic was palpable now. He realized the damage to his credibility was irreparable. Ellie glanced at Julian, a mixture of relief, pride, and lingering emotion in her eyes. "We did it," she whispered softly, but loud enough for him to hear. Julian nodded, his eyes scanning the room, ensuring that every piece of evidence had its effect. "We did," he said, voice low but resolute. "But it's not just about winning. It's about protecting the integrity of what we love." As the auctioneer called for the final bids, the room's energy shifted. Collectors, now aware of the truth, competed fiercely. The hammer fell, and the Ferrari sold for a record sum, far exceeding Simon's expectations and leaving him speechless. His plan to devalue the car and profit collapsed completely. Simon, defeated and exposed, slunk away from the crowd, muttering under his breath. The murmurs followed him, a chorus of condemnation. Julian and Ellie, standing side by side, felt the tension finally release. The room buzzed not only with the excitement of a high-stakes auction, but with the satisfaction of justice served. Outside the auction house, Montana's late afternoon sun warmed the streets. Julian and Ellie stepped into the light, taking a deep breath. The battle was over. Their reputations were intact, the Ferrari's authenticity had been proven, and Simon's deceit had been publicly dismantled. Ellie exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time in days. "It's done," she said. "No more lies. No more threats." Julian looked at her, a small smile breaking through his usually composed exterior. "Yes, and we did it together. Every step of the way." She returned the smile, feeling a sense of closure, but also the first glimmer of new beginnings. "So what now?" she asked. Julian's gaze lingered on the car, then on her. "Now," he said, "we build something that's ours. Not just a restoration, not just a collection, but a partnership. In every sense of the word." Ellie nodded, understanding fully. Their connection had been tested by doubt, betrayal, and high-stakes conflict, but it had endured. As they walked away from the auction house, side by side, the weight of the past lifted, replaced by the promise of a future built on trust, shared passion, and the road ahead. The Ferrari gleamed behind them, a symbol of integrity, skill, and perseverance. And Julian and Ellie, having faced the storm together, were finally ready to shape a new chapter, not dictated by deceit or manipulation, but by their own choices, together.